The holographic display flickered to life and filled the center of the room with light. Text appeared first, floating in the air where everyone could read it. It said, Earth Conflict Archive, The Siege of New Houston, 2847 CE. Below that, smaller text added, Warning, unedited combat footage. Then, the images began. The first thing the cadets saw was fire. Buildings were burning. Smoke rose in thick black columns against a gray sky. The streets were filled with rubble and broken vehicles. Bodies lay scattered across the ground, some human, some alien. The sound came next, and it was louder than anything the cadets expected. Human weapons did not fire elegant energy beams like Kalthari rifles. They did not hum with quiet power like Vithani plasma cannons. Human weapons roared. They cracked and thundered and screamed. Each shot sounded like a small explosion. The noise was constant and deafening. Chemical propellant weapons, Zirin observed, her logical mind analyzing what she saw. Primitive. They use controlled explosions to launch metal projectiles. Inefficient compared to energy weapons. But then she saw what those primitive weapons did to bodies, and her voice died in her throat. A human soldier appeared on screen. The footage identified her as Lieutenant Katie Walsh. She was young, perhaps 30 years old by human standards. Her face was covered in dirt and blood. Her armor was cracked and scorched. She led a small squad of 8 soldiers through the ruins of what had once been a marketplace. Enemy fire came from all directions. The cadets recognized the attackers as syndicate troops, a criminal organization that raided colonies for slaves and resources. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, hidden in the surrounding buildings. One of Walsh's soldiers fell. A projectile had torn through his shoulder, and he collapsed against a broken wall. Blood poured from the wound. He was screaming. Zirin expected Lieutenant Walsh to call for retreat. The mathematics were clear. They were outnumbered at least 8-1. Their position was exposed. The logical choice was to fall back and find better ground. Walsh did not retreat. Instead, she ran toward her fallen soldier. Enemy fire struck the ground around her feet. A round grazed her arm, and she stumbled, but did not stop. She grabbed the wounded man by his armor and began dragging him toward cover. With her other hand, she raised her weapon and fired back at the enemy. She was screaming something. The translator rendered her words as, "Nobody gets left behind. Keep moving. Nobody gets left behind." Korath leaned forward in his seat. His eyes were fixed on the screen. Among the Bruhl, wounded warriors were often left to die. Resources were precious, and a wounded soldier slowed everyone down. It was considered honorable to sacrifice yourself so others could escape. But this human woman was risking her own life to save one injured soldier. "She will die," Korath muttered. "She is being foolish." But Walsh did not die. She reached cover, pushed her wounded soldier into the arms of a medic, and immediately turned back toward the fight. Her squad formed up around her. They checked their weapons. They reloaded. And then they moved forward, toward the enemy. "What are they doing?" a Vithani cadet whispered. "They should be retreating. The numbers clearly show they cannot win this engagement." Yenix, the Sirathi empath, pressed her hands against her temples. Her face had gone pale. "The emotions," she gasped. "I can feel them through the footage. Fear. So much fear. They are terrified." "Then why do they not run?" another cadet asked. "Because there is something else," Yenix whispered. "Something stronger than the fear. I do not have a word for it. It burns like fire inside them." On screen, Walsh led her squad into the enemy position. The fighting became close and brutal. Humans used their rifles as clubs when they ran out of ammunition. They threw themselves at enemies twice their size. One soldier tackled a syndicate fighter through a window, and they fell 2 stories together, still fighting as they hit the ground. The cadets watched in stunned silence. This was not warfare as they understood it. This was something raw and primal and terrifying. A new section of footage began. The timestamp showed it was 3 days later. A sergeant named Danny Callahan was leading a defense of a civilian shelter. The building was surrounded. Ammunition was running low. Callahan ordered his soldiers to fix their blades to their rifles. Blades? Zirin said in disbelief. They are going to fight with blades against projectile weapons? Callahan did not wait for the enemy to come to him. When his rifle clicked empty, he charged out of the building directly into the syndicate line. He was a blur of movement, his blade flashing in the smoke-filled air. He killed 4 enemies before they managed to bring him down. But those few seconds were enough. His squad used the distraction to flank the enemy position. They saved the shelter. They saved 300 civilians hiding inside. Callahan died with his blade still in his hand and a smile on his bloody face. Korath made a strange sound, something between a growl and a whimper. Among the Brule, a warrior who sacrificed himself for glory was honored. But Callahan had not died for glory. He had died for civilians he had never met. He had died so that others could live. Why? Korath asked quietly. Why would he do this? Commander Morrison spoke from his seat at the side of the room. His voice was calm and soft, but it carried through the silence. Because they needed him to, Morrison said simply. That is all the reason a human soldier requires. The footage continued. The cadets watched humans perform acts of courage and violence that defied every logical analysis. They watched soldiers laugh in the middle of firefights and cry over fallen friends. They watched medics work on wounded patients while buildings burned around them. They watched officers lead charges against impossible odds. And slowly, the cadets began to understand that they had been wrong about humans. These small, fragile, primitive creatures were not weak. They were something far more dangerous. They were survivors. The footage continued without pause. Minute after minute, the cadets watched humans fight and bleed and die on the ruined streets of New Houston Colony. The holographic display showed everything in perfect detail. Every wound, every death, every act of desperate courage. A medic named Lisa Grant appeared on screen. She was a small woman with short brown hair and steady hands. The footage showed her working inside a burning building. The ceiling was cracking. Pieces of debris fell around her. Other soldiers were shouting at her to evacuate, but she refused to move. She was operating on a wounded soldier. His chest was open, and she had her hands inside him, trying to stop the bleeding. Sweat poured down her face. Smoke filled her lungs, but her hands never shook. "Patient first," she said through gritted teeth. "We do not leave until he is stable." The ceiling groaned. More debris fell. A beam crashed down just 3 feet from where she was working. Grant did not even look up. 10 minutes later, she carried the wounded soldier out of the building on her back. The structure collapsed behind her. She set him down gently, checked his vital signs, and then stood up. "Where is the next one?" she asked. A soldier pointed toward another ruined building. Grant picked up her medical bag and started walking toward it. 3 Sirathi cadets stood up and quietly left the room. Their empathic abilities could not handle the intensity of emotion bleeding through the footage. One of them was crying. Another looked like she might be sick. Yennex stayed in her seat, but her whole body was trembling. The footage shifted to a new location. A communications officer named Ethan Price was defending a bridge with only 7 soldiers under his command. The bridge was the only route to a civilian evacuation point. If the enemy crossed it, 2,000 refugees would die. The syndicate sent 200 soldiers to take that bridge. Price and his 7 defenders held their ground for 6 hours. The footage showed the battle in fragments. It showed Price dragging wounded soldiers to cover while still calling in artillery strikes. It showed him bandaging his own wounds with one hand, while firing his rifle with the other. It showed his soldiers falling one by one until only Price remained. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found Price sitting against a wall of sandbags. He was covered in blood. His rifle was empty. Around him lay the bodies of enemies he had killed in hand-to-hand combat when his ammunition ran out. The reinforcement commander asked him if he needed medical attention. Price looked up with exhausted eyes and said 3 words: water, ammunition, orders. He was asking where the next fight was. Zirin stood suddenly. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor. Everyone turned to look at her. "This is wrong," she said. Her voice was shaking. "This is completely irrational. The mathematics clearly show that they should have surrendered. They could not win. They had no chance of victory. Why did they keep fighting?" Instructor Vexnar looked at her calmly. "That is an excellent question. Would you like to hear the answer?" "The answer does not matter," Zirin said. She was backing toward the door. "This is madness. These humans are insane. Fighting without hope of victory is illogical. It serves no purpose." Commander Morrison stood up slowly. All eyes in the room turned toward him. He was shorter than most of the aliens present, smaller and weaker by every physical measure. But somehow, in that moment, he seemed larger than anyone else in the room. "Lieutenant Price did not fight because he calculated his odds of victory," Morrison said quietly. "He fought because 2,000 people were counting on him to hold that bridge. He fought because his soldiers trusted him to lead them. He fought because running away would have meant betraying everyone who believed in him." Zirin shook her head. "That is not logical." "No," Morrison agreed. "It is not. But it is human." Zirin left the room without another word. She was not the last to leave. Over the next hour, the footage showed more scenes of impossible courage. It showed soldiers sharing their last food with enemy prisoners who had surrendered. It showed officers weeping over the bodies of fallen friends, then wiping their eyes and returning to command their units. It showed humans singing songs in the middle of artillery bombardments, their voices rising above the thunder of explosions. It also showed darker things. It showed human soldiers executing syndicate fighters who had tortured civilians. It showed the cold fury in their eyes as they delivered justice without mercy. It showed that humans were capable of great kindness and terrible violence, sometimes in the same breath. By the 90-minute mark, another 15 cadets had left the room. Some walked out quickly, their faces pale with shock. Others moved slowly, as if in a daze, unable to process what they had witnessed. Korath remained in his seat. The massive Brule warrior had not moved for over an hour. His hands gripped his armrest so tightly that the metal was bending. His eyes never left the screen. "I was wrong," he whispered to himself. "I was completely wrong about them." Yenix was crying silently. Tears ran down her pale cheeks, but she did not look away from the footage. She could feel every emotion that had passed through those human soldiers. The fear, the love, the rage, the hope, the grief. It was overwhelming, but she forced herself to keep watching. She needed to understand. They all needed to understand. Because what they were witnessing was not madness. The footage ended, and the lights slowly rose. The holographic display faded away, leaving only empty air where images of war had been. The room fell into complete silence. Of the 62 cadets who had started the lesson, only 29 remained in their seats. The others had withdrawn one by one over the past 2 hours. Some had left quietly, unable to continue watching. Others had left with tears in their eyes or looks of horror on their faces. Half the class was gone. Those who remained sat in stunned silence. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. They simply stared at the empty space where the images had been, trying to process what they had witnessed. Korath was the first to speak. The massive Brule warrior's voice came out soft and uncertain, nothing like his usual confident growl. My people believe that courage is measured by strength, he said slowly. We believe that honor comes from victory in battle. The strongest warrior wins, and that is the natural order. He paused and looked at Commander Morrison. But your soldiers were not the strongest. They were outnumbered. They were outgunned. Many of them died. Morrison nodded. Yes, many of them died. But they won, Korath continued. They held out for 3 weeks against impossible odds. They saved their colony. They saved their people. His massive hands unclenched slowly. And when they won, they wept. Yes, Morrison said again. We always weep, even when we win. Korath's brow furrowed in confusion. I do not understand. Victory should bring joy. Survival should bring relief. Why do your warriors cry when they have succeeded? Morrison stood and walked slowly toward the center of the room. Every eye followed him. He stopped on the platform, where the holographic display had been, and turned to face the remaining cadets. We weep because winning means we lived, and living means we remember. We remember the friends who died beside us. We remember the soldiers who sacrificed themselves so we could survive. We remember every face, every name, every promise we made to bring them home safely. His voice was calm, but heavy with something the cadets could not quite identify. Victory does not erase loss. Survival does not heal grief. Every human soldier carries the weight of the people they could not save. We carry them forever. Yennex spoke up, her voice still trembling from the emotional impact of the footage. I felt them, she said. Through the recording, I could sense what they were feeling. Every single one of them was afraid. The fear was overwhelming. It should have paralyzed them. It should have made them run. She shook her head slowly. But they did not run. They kept fighting. How is that possible? Morrison looked at her with something like respect in his eyes. Your empathic abilities serve you well, he said. You are right. Every human soldier in that footage was terrified. We are always terrified. Fear is our constant companion in battle. Then how do you function? Another cadet asked. How do you aim your weapons? How do you follow orders? How do you charge into enemy fire? Because we have learned something that fear does not want us to know, Morrison answered. Fear is not the enemy of courage. Fear is the fuel that courage burns. A soldier who feels no fear is not brave. They are simply numb. But a soldier who feels fear and fights anyway, who pushes through the terror because something matters more than their own survival, that is true courage. Instructor Vexnar stepped forward. His earlier clinical detachment had been replaced by something more solemn. The old Kelthari looked at his remaining students with new eyes. The siege of New Houston was not unique, Vexnar said. Human military history contains thousands of similar engagements. Their species has been at war, in some form, for their entire recorded existence. They fought each other for resources, for territory, for ideas. They fought other species when they reached the stars. They have faced extinction-level threats and refused to accept defeat. He paused to let his words sink in. Every species in this room has military traditions stretching back thousands of years. But no species has as much experience with warfare as humans. They are not the strongest. They are not the most advanced. But they have learned lessons about survival that we are only beginning to understand. A Kelthari cadet raised his hand. Instructor, if humans are so dangerous, why do other species in the coalition not fear them more? Why are they treated as newcomers and primitives? Vexnar exchanged a glance with Morrison before answering. Because most species only see humans in peacetime. When humans are at war, it is a different story. They see small, short-lived creatures with basic technology and emotional natures. They see what humans choose to show them. And what humans choose to show, Morrison added, is not what we become when war begins. Korath leaned forward. What do you become? Morrison met his gaze directly. We become whatever we need to be, warriors, killers, healers, builders. We adapt, we endure, we survive, and we never ever give up, not while there is breath in our lungs and people counting on us to keep fighting. The room fell silent again as the cadets absorbed his words. Many of them were looking at Morrison differently now. They no longer saw a small primitive creature from a young species. They saw a representative of something far more complex and formidable than they had ever imagined. Yennex wiped the tears from her face and asked one final question. "The love I felt from them," she said softly, "it was as strong as the fear. They loved each other. They loved their families back home. They loved their colony. Is that why they kept fighting? Is that the thing I could not name?" Morrison smiled for the first time. It was a small, tired smile, worn down by years of service and loss. "Yes," he said simply. "That is exactly why we keep fighting. Love is the only thing stronger than fear. And humans love fiercely." 3 days after the screening, official Academy records showed that 4 more cadets had formally withdrawn from the program. Their withdrawal statements all mentioned the same reason. They could not serve alongside a species capable of such sustained violence. They could not look at humans without remembering the footage. They were afraid. Zirin was among them. The logical Vithani had tried to return to her studies, but she found herself unable to concentrate. Every time she saw a human cadet in the hallway, she remembered Lieutenant Walsh dragging her wounded soldier through enemy fire. She remembered Sergeant Callahan charging into death with a smile on his face. She remembered Ethan Price asking for ammunition instead of rest. The mathematics of warfare no longer made sense to her. And without mathematics, Zirin did not know how to understand the universe. But among those who remained at the Academy, something remarkable was happening. Korath sought out Commander Morrison in the officers' dining hall one evening. The massive Brule warrior sat across from the human and studied him in silence for a long moment. Morrison continued eating his meal, patient and unhurried. "I wish to understand," Korath finally said. "My people fight for glory. The Kelthari fight for territory and order. The Vithani fight only when logic demands it. Every species has a reason for warfare that makes sense within their nature." He leaned forward, his deep voice carrying honest confusion. "But humans fight for things I cannot fully grasp. You fight for love. You fight for people you have never met. You fight because you promised someone you would. You fight even when there is no logical reason to continue." Morrison set down his utensils and met Korath's gaze. "That is true. What do you call this thing that drives you?" Morrison considered the question carefully. "We have many words for it. Duty, honor, stubbornness, heart." He shook his head slightly. "None of them capture the full meaning. It is something that lives inside us, deeper than thought. When someone we care about is in danger, we do not calculate odds, we act. When the people beside us are dying, we do not run, we stay. It is not always rational, it is simply who we are." Korath nodded slowly. "This is why other species fear you. Perhaps. It is also why I wish to serve alongside you." The Brule warrior extended his massive hand across the table. "I came to this academy believing I already understood warfare. I was wrong. Teach me what humans know about fighting. Teach me what it means to have heart." Morrison reached out and clasped Korath's hand. His grip was firm, despite the difference in their sizes. "It would be my honor," he said. In the weeks that followed, the dynamic of the entire academy began to shift. Human cadets, who had previously been treated as curiosities from a backward planet, suddenly found themselves sought out by their alien peers. Questions came constantly. How do you control your fear in combat? How do you maintain loyalty to your unit under extreme stress? How do you keep fighting when victory seems impossible? How do you carry the weight of fallen friends without breaking? The answers were never simple. Humans spoke of training and discipline, but also of trust and brotherhood. They spoke of something they called morale, a concept that had no direct translation in most alien languages. They described how soldiers who fought beside each other long enough became more than comrades. They became family, and family, humans explained, was worth dying for. Yenix continued her studies at the academy, but she also spent many hours in quiet conversation with human cadets and officers. Her empathic abilities gave her unique insight into human emotions, and what she discovered amazed her. Humans contained multitudes. They could feel fear and courage at the same time. They could hate their enemies and show them mercy in the same breath. They could grieve for the dead and find joy in survival without contradiction. Their emotional landscape was vast and complex, filled with depths that Yenix had never encountered in any other species. "You are exhausting," she told a human cadet one afternoon, smiling despite herself. "Your emotions are so loud, so tangled, so alive." The cadet grinned. "We get that a lot." 6 months later, Commander Morrison received transfer orders. He was being assigned to a coalition warship, where his experience would be more valuable. The night before his departure, Instructor Vexnar found him in the shuttle bay, packing his belongings. "I have taught at this academy for 40 years, Vexnar said, his blue scales reflecting the dim lights of the hangar. "I have shown that footage to 9 different classes. The reaction is always the same: terror, confusion, withdrawal." Morrison shouldered his bag and turned to face the old instructor. "Does it bother you?" "It used to," Vexnar admitted. "I thought perhaps we were traumatizing young cadets unnecessarily. I questioned whether the lesson was worth the cost. And now I understand." The Kelthari's scales shifted colors in what Morrison had learned to recognize as expression of grim respect. The cadets who leave were never suited for the realities of war. It is better that they discover this in a classroom than on a battlefield. The ones who stay learn something valuable about what they may face, and the ones who seek to learn from humans become the finest officers in the coalition. Morrison nodded. "Humanity has been at war with itself and everything else for our entire existence. We have learned hard lessons, paid for them in blood. If our pain can teach others, then perhaps it was not entirely wasted." Vexnar inclined his head. "Safe travels, Commander, and thank you." Morrison walked to his shuttle, then paused at the ramp. He looked back at Vexnar one last time. "Instructor," he said, "humanity is not a threat to the coalition. We are not monsters seeking conquest. We are simply a species that learned long ago that the universe does not care about fairness or logic or hope. So we stopped waiting for the universe to be kind. We started fighting for what we wanted instead. And that," Vexnar replied, "is precisely what makes you terrifying." Morrison smiled that same tired, knowing smile he had shown the cadets months ago. "Good. The galaxy should be a little bit terrified. It keeps the peace better than any treaty ever could." He boarded his shuttle and was gone, leaving behind an academy forever changed by a single lesson about human warfare. In the training halls and classrooms of Nexara Prime, a new class of cadets was already assembling. In 3 months, they would face the footage from New Houston. Some would flee in terror, some would endure and learn, and humanity's reputation would continue to grow, one horrified cadet at a time. Because that was what humans did. They survived, they remembered, and they never stopped fighting. The Galactic Military Academy stood on a world called Nexara Prime. It was a beautiful planet, with purple skies and twin suns that painted everything in golden light. For 300 years, this academy had trained the best soldiers and officers from across the known galaxy. Young cadets came from dozens of different alien species. They learned to fight together, to trust each other, and to serve the unified Galactic Coalition. On this particular morning, 62 new cadets sat in a large circular room. The room was built like a theater, with seats rising up in rows around a central platform. Holographic projectors hung from the ceiling, ready to display images in perfect three-dimensional detail. The cadets were nervous and excited. This was their first major lesson in species combat analysis, a class that every cadet had to pass. Instructor Vexnar walked into the room, and the cadets fell silent. Vexnar was a Kelthari, a species known for their tall bodies and blue scales that shimmered in the light. He had taught at the academy for 40 years. His eyes were cold and sharp, missing nothing. Behind him walked a human officer in a simple gray uniform. The human was Commander Jake Morrison. He was of average height, lean and quiet. His hair was cut short and touched with gray at the temples. His face carried the look of someone who had seen many difficult things. He did not smile. He simply took a seat at the side of the room and watched the cadets with calm, patient eyes. The cadets studied him with curiosity. Humans were newcomers to the galactic community. They had only made contact with other species 80 years ago. By galactic standards, they were considered primitive and young. Their technology was basic. Their lifespans were short. Many species wondered why they had even been allowed to join the coalition. A young Vithani female named Zirin leaned toward the cadet beside her. The Vithani were thin creatures with large eyes and gray skin. They were famous for their logical minds and their love of mathematics and analysis. Humans, Zirin whispered. I have read about them. They are fragile and emotional. Their bodies break easily. I do not understand why the coalition values them. The cadet beside her was Korath, a Bruhl warrior. The Bruhl were massive creatures, nearly 8 feet tall, with thick muscles and skin like leather. They came from a harsh world where only the strong survived. Korath looked at the human commander and snorted. Small, Korath said. Weak. My youngest offspring could defeat him in combat. Sitting in the row behind them was Yenix, a Sirathi female. The Sirathi were delicate beings with pale skin and large sensitive eyes. They possessed empathic abilities, meaning they could feel the emotions of others around them. Yenix said nothing, but she watched Commander Morrison with quiet interest. Something about the human felt different to her, though she could not explain what. Instructor Vexnar raised one hand, and the room fell completely silent. Welcome to Species Combat Analysis, he said. His voice was deep and carried easily through the room. In this class, you will study how different species approach warfare. You will watch real combat footage. You will learn the strengths and weaknesses of your future allies and enemies. This knowledge may one day save your life. He pressed a button, and a holographic display appeared in the center of the room. Images flashed across it, showing various alien species in battle. Over the past weeks, you have studied the Kelthari border wars. You learned how my people use discipline and formation to defeat our enemies. You studied the Bruhl unification, and you saw how raw strength and fearless charges won an entire planet. You analyzed the Vithani logic campaigns, where mathematical precision destroyed opposing fleets without a single wasted shot. The cadets nodded. They had found those lessons interesting, but not surprising. Each species fought according to its nature. The Kelthari were disciplined. The Bruhl were strong. The Vithani were logical. Everything made sense. Today, Vexnar continued, we will study human warfare. A few cadets laughed quietly. Others exchanged amused looks. Human warfare? What could there possibly be to learn from such a young and primitive species? Zirin smiled to herself. This should be quick, she whispered. Perhaps we will finish early today. Korath cracked his massive knuckles. I hope they at least show us something entertaining. Commander Morrison heard their whispers. He did not react. He simply sat in his chair, with his hands folded in his lap, watching and waiting. His face showed nothing, but his eyes held a strange weight, like a man who knew a secret that others did not. Instructor Vexnar noticed the amusement spreading through the cadets. He let it continue for a moment before speaking again. "I understand your assumptions," he said calmly. "Humans are physically weaker than most species in this room. Their technology is not as advanced as ours. Their species is young, and they have been part of the coalition for less than a century." He paused. "However, I must warn you. What you are about to see may disturb you. This footage is unedited and contains graphic violence. If at any point you feel unable to continue, you may leave the room without penalty." This caught the cadets' attention. They had watched Brule warriors tear enemies apart with their bare hands. They had seen Kelthari soldiers execute prisoners without hesitation. Why would human footage require a warning? Yennex felt a cold sensation run through her body. Her empathic abilities were picking up something strange. She looked at Commander Morrison again. The human sat perfectly still, but beneath his calm surface, she sensed something vast and heavy. It felt like an ocean of memory, deep and dark, and filled with things she could not understand. "The footage we will watch today comes from a human colony world called Arden 4, Vexnar explained. 40 years ago, a rogue syndicate fleet attacked this colony without warning. The humans had minimal defenses. They were outnumbered and outgunned. What followed was a 3-week siege that has become required study material at this academy." He looked across the room at the young faces watching him. "Pay close attention," he said. "By the end of this lesson, you will understand why humans were granted coalition membership. And you will understand why some species in this galaxy have learned to fear them." The lights dimmed. The holographic projectors hummed to life. And the cadets of the Galactic Military Academy prepared to watch humanity at war. None of them were prepared for what they were about to see.